I'm MTG, and welcome to a Deck Tech Breakdown. And today we're going over Jodah the Unifier. So thank you to Brian Kane for your submission, really, because wow, this was a really challenging yet interesting commander to build around. At least for me, just because 5-color commanders sometimes give me decision paralysis because there's a lot of really cool cards in Magic. But even harder, I think, still when your commander cares about legendary tribal, because there are so many amazing legendary creatures in Magic. How the heck do you narrow them down? So that's one thing that we're hoping to get into a little bit with this video today. So before doing that, let's talk about what this commander does. So Jodah the Unifier is we work to cast it, and what it does just passively, which is huge and crazy, is legendary creatures you control get +X/+X, where X is the number of legendary creatures you control. So that's just its passive value that it has. Let's get to the really crazy value that this commander puts out, which is whenever you cast a legendary spell from your hand, exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a legendary non-land card with lesser mana value. You may cast that card without paying its mana cost. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in random order. So this instantly made me think of Cascade effects, right? Because Cascade essentially does the same thing, but this one cares just specifically about legendary, spells that you're casting. So with this, it's interesting to think about, like, okay, now am I putting potentially cards that are expensive to cast out for free, but then they're also going to get an Anthem boost just for other legendaries being out on the field. So this is just so much value just from one card. It's going to be a pretty huge powerhouse, at least just from my experience with playing against it in Historic Brawl. It's been really crazy and kind of reminds me of how like slivers snowballs. So like once Jodah gets their first trigger, then just seeing like how many more horrifying things are put on the battlefield and how many things you have to answer is pretty insane. So going into kind of like what I think this commander obviously wants is legendary tribal. I think y'all got that from the initial read of that card. So to kind of help me narrow down like what cards I want to work with, essentially, I was just like, holy heck, I don't know. There's so many cool cards. Like, how do I decide what makes sense for this commander? And I got this really good advice from another YouTuber, and you can find them on Twitter as well, Jolt MTG, and I'll have their information over here. So go check out their channel if you want. But basically said, like, if you have a hard time deciding like how to build around 5-color commanders, what really helps them is basically picking out 3 colors and leaning into like whatever mechanics and strategies you like from those 3 colors. And then that way, like, it kind of takes some of like the freedom of decision away from like, how do I narrow down things, if you're kind of putting yourself in like a little bit of like a template or focus a bit more on what you want. And so that's what I try to do for this commander as well. Now for kind of things that I think key components for this deck to like really work are going to be, one, making sure you know how to mana fix efficiently. And so a big piece of that is going to probably come from just spending a lot of money on your mana base. So things like triomes, fetch lands, I think are going to be huge. You probably could pull this off with a more budget-friendly version of essentially your land base, but I don't know. I think you're going to be sacrificing a lot of speed doing that and potentially just die before you can really pop off. But it also depends like what power level you're trying to go for. But I think if you're going to be playing like 5-color commanders, you're really going to have to invest money into your land base, just because you need to really mana fix efficiently. And unfortunately, all the really cool fetch lands and triomes are a bit pricey. So, or even just the shock lands and stuff too. But overall, I think like if this is a commander you're seriously interested in investing a lot of time and effort into, it might be worth to, throw down on those nicer lands, or maybe play around with like a cheaper, more budget friendly land base. And then if you really like your commander, then slowly upgrade it over time. Aside from just having the good fancy lands, I think ramp, because you have access to green, is going to be super crucial. So obviously, like, you have your 3 visits and your nature's lures that are going to be really helpful for grabbing like forest lands, which if you have triomes with forest and like the key word on that, then you can grab those lands pretty easily. This is just a personal preference, but when it comes to like trying to like ramp or mana fix or anything like that, I try to stay away from like using mana dorks or artifacts, just because I'm used to playing at tables that have a tendency to do a lot of board wipes or run removal. So if I'm depending on like a mana dork or like a mana rock to keep me like on track for whatever mana I need, chances are, at least in my table that I usually play at, it's just gonna blow up and die. So I lean more towards just like creatures that help you, put lands onto the battlefield, since land destruction is more frowned upon, or like casting like rampant growth type things, or, again, like free visits, where you're putting lands onto the battlefield instead of like creatures or artifacts that tap for mana. And that's just what I do to try to keep my mana base essentially alive and consistent. As you're building this commander, that you're thinking about like essentially the mana curve of all of your legendaries, and that you're not putting in like too many like 7-cost creatures, putting that card onto the battlefield that's less than the initial like legendary spell that you cast. Like, you don't want to cast like a 5 CMC legendary spell and then realize you don't have like any 3 or 4 like drops for yourself to hit that trigger, because you put like all your stonks into like huge legendary creatures. So I guess just something to keep in mind is like, even though there are a lot of exciting cards, to just make sure that you're trying to still have a decent like mana curve with that. I don't know how much of a struggle that's going to be for some folks, but I just know that with these kind of commanders that have a tendency to cheat stuff out, people will invest quite a bit in kind of like the bigger creatures, because they're the bigger, splashier plays. But you also want to make sure that like you're still hitting like the perks of what Jodah has to offer by kind of, again, smoothing out like that mana curve for plays that you want to make. Hope that makes sense. Anyways, moving on to the next thing is protection. So there's a few different ways I think that you can approach this. One is, if I see a Jodah player sitting at the table, I'm probably going to be more focused on that person, just because of what the commander does. It's very difficult, and I think once it pops off, it's going to be difficult to just stop that, because the board state will just be easier to rebuild over and over again. So I think one of the key pieces for this is to anticipate people probably countering your commander when you cast it, or the moment you cast it, it gets killed. So I think there's a few ways you can try to protect like your commander from either of those things. One is to have at least not cast your commander until you have a protection spell ready. So like a counter spell or a phase out thing, and that way you're ready for like when the table's like, let's deal with this horrifying commander. And some of my favorite ways to kind of deal with any sort of like removal is just phasing out. So Slip Out the Back is a super good card, and I think it's really important for just general protection pieces, because if you make something indestructible or hexproof, that'll only help them in certain circumstances, but Slip Out the Back can save it through like anything. So if there's like a toxic deluge, like Heroic Intervention isn't going to save your stuff, but if you can phase out with like Guardian of Faith or Slip Out the Back on something, like now they're going to make it through whatever those like minus effects are. Even like Farewell, if you can phase out, you can dodge like exile effects and stuff like that. And then for like counter spells, we have access to stuff like Fierce Guardianship, which I love. I know some people are very sad at like free cost, spells, but they're out there in the wild and in game stores and stuff. So I don't know. I put them into my deck, but I do think that having at least a counter spell or a few, just mainly focused not necessarily in shutting down what your opponents are trying to do, but to try at least keep your board state protected, are probably going to be good adds there. Another thing too, when I think about like protection, is going to be like anti-theft. So homeward path or something that allows me to get my creatures back to my board after someone tries to steal them or, pulls them out of my graveyard or something. Because something I hate more than anything else is having my creatures stolen from me and used against me. Moving on to cards that have high synergy with this commander. Shanid Sleeper's Scourge. It's a Mardu card, so it's one colorless, mountain, plain, and swamp. And so what this one does is it gives other legendary creatures you control menace, and then if you play a legendary land or cast a legendary spell, you get to draw a card and pay 1 life to do so. So that's good card draw and adding, evasion to your board so it's easier to hit your opponents. Very nice. I think that's going to be a great card. Another one too that I really love, I'm going to make this a commander, is Rata Drawbrick of Urborg. So it is crazy because it creates a 2/2 zombie copy of whatever legendary creature dies, but it's not a legendary. So if you have things that care about ETB effects or death triggers or, drain effects out on the board, you can essentially put 2 on the board if you have a way to get that legendary creature out of your graveyard. And then too, there's a new planeswalker that was a face of the precons that they're selling, which is Diada, Finder of Wills. And so, the +2 ability alone tells you that this commander cares about legendaries. So up to 1 target legendary creature gains Vigilance, Lifelink, and Indestructible until your next turn. So I won't go into the other ones here just for the sake of time of what else she can do with her loyalty stuff, but it just overall seems very powerful and good for just keeping your board state protected a little bit too, because the indestructible until the next turn. So you're forcing people to essentially either cast things like Toxic Deluge or some sort of exile effect to deal with the threat that you have on the table. This other card seems very fun, especially for legendary tribal decks, which is Primeval's Glorious Rebirth. And it does cost 7, but the cool part about this is return all legendary permanent cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. So that could be legendary enchantments, legendary lands, legendary creatures. All them things go back onto the battlefield. So I think that is pretty heckin' sweet. And then some other general synergy cards. So Eska, God of the Tree, flips into, or you can pay the backside essentially, which is Prismatic Bridge. And when you put that onto the battlefield, it is pretty much like having the secondary Jodah effect. I'm really curious if you've played this commander or if you've built it, what have been some really good synergy cards for you. And really, if you have any recommendations for people that are trying to build this commander, there's a lot to choose from. And so I think everyone is going to have their own take because there's a lot of possibilities with this. Thank you so much for watching, and feel free to drop any requests in the comments of commanders you'd like to see me do deck tech for. And again, if you have any card recommendations for this commander, feel free to let me know as well, because I love that and I learn a lot from everyone suggesting cards, because I think we all kind of get used to what we see at our game stores and our play groups. And so getting people from around the world with different perspectives on what they like to play really helps just expand knowledge, I guess, overall. So thank you so much for watching and have a good one. Bye.